241. Inside a hospital room that had almost forgotten what sound felt like. The air hung still, heavy, as if even time itself had slowed to a cautious crawl. On the narrow bed, Pete Edochie lay motionless beneath a cold white light, the faint glow casting sharp shadows across a face that once carried commanding strength, now thinned by what sources described as a final stage illness. The heart monitor beside him continued its steady rhythm, a quiet, mechanical reassurance that felt strangely out of place against the tension in the room. According to reports, his condition had deteriorated rapidly in the past hours, the disease believed to have reached its most critical phase. His fingers trembled ever so slightly, almost imperceptible, as though holding on to something unseen. Each breath came heavier than the last, drawn out, uneven, as if every inhale required effort his body could no longer afford. His eyes, once sharp and deeply expressive, no longer seemed to focus, drifting somewhere distant, somewhere beyond the reach of the people gathered around him. And yet, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been understood without words. Edochie stood a few steps away from the bed, completely still, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on his father, yet somehow avoiding the full weight of what he was seeing. There was no anger, no outburst, only a silence so dense it seemed to press down on his chest. Linc Edochie, on the other side of the room, turned his face slightly away, as if even a second too long of direct eye contact with that fragile moment might break something inside him. His jaw tightened, his breathing shallow, his eyes glistening under the dim light he refused to look toward. Between them, the space felt stretched, fragile, as though any sudden movement might shatter it completely. According to those close to the family, the hours leading up to this moment had been filled with quiet anticipation. Doctors moving in and out, voices lowered, conversations cut short whenever either son stepped closer to the door. There were whispers of hope earlier in the night, small reassurances that perhaps the situation might stabilize, that perhaps this was just another difficult phase. But as the minutes passed, those reassurances faded into something else. Something heavier, something unspoken. The machine continued its steady beeping, each sound marking time in a way that felt almost cruel. A nurse adjusted a line gently, her movements careful, respectful, as though aware she was stepping into something deeply personal. Outside, the corridor remained dim, the distant echo of footsteps occasionally reaching the room, only to disappear again into silence. Inside, however, everything seemed suspended, a moment stretched so thin it felt like it might never end. Pete's chest rose and fell, slower now, each breath spaced further apart than the last. His hand, once trembling, grew still. Yule shifted slightly, just enough to take a small step closer, but stopped midway, as if unsure whether to continue. Linc's fingers curled into his palm, his head lowering just a fraction more. No one said his name. No one called out, because in that fragile, suspended second, there was a shared understanding that words might only make it more real. That moment, no one in the room dared to say what everyone already knew. The thought lingered without being spoken, hanging between them like the faint hum of the machines. Somewhere beyond the window, the night remained unchanged, unaware of what was unfolding inside. A soft draft moved the edge of the curtain, letting in a sliver of pale light from the hallway. The door, slightly ajar, creaked almost silently as it shifted, but no one entered, and no one moved to close it. Just a few months earlier, nothing felt urgent, nothing felt final. And yet, looking back, the signs were already there, scattered quietly across ordinary days that no one thought to question at the time. It began with something subtle, an unusual fatigue that seemed to linger longer than it should. Pete Edochie, a man known for his commanding presence and unwavering energy, was, according to many sources, starting to withdraw in ways that were difficult to explain. Appearances became less frequent, invitations declined more often, and when he did show up, there was a noticeable shift. His voice, once deep and firm, carried a slower rhythm, as though each word required a moment of thought before it could be released. At first, it was easy to dismiss. After all, age brings changes, and those around him wanted to believe that was all it was. But within the family, a quiet unease had already begun to form. Edochie would later recall, in fragments and pauses, the first moment something felt undeniably different. It wasn't during a dramatic event, not during a public appearance, but in the stillness of a simple family meal. The table was set as it always had been, familiar dishes, familiar voices, familiar routines, and yet, in the middle of a conversation, there was a pause. Pete stopped speaking, not for long, just a few seconds, but long enough for the silence to feel out of place. His eyes drifted slightly, as if searching for something just beyond reach, and when he resumed, the words came slower, less certain. Yule didn't say anything then. He simply watched. Because sometimes, the first realization doesn't come with clarity, it comes with a feeling, a quiet discomfort that settles in the chest without explanation. Across the table, Linc noticed it too. But where Yule leaned into that discomfort, Linc instinctively pulled away from it. In his mind, there had to be a simpler explanation. Fatigue, stress, age, anything but what it might truly be. He continued the conversation, filled the silence, even smiled slightly as if to smooth over the moment, because accepting something deeper would mean confronting a reality he wasn't ready to face. According to those close to the family, these small moments began to repeat themselves. Not often, not enough to raise alarm immediately, but enough to leave a trace. A forgotten word here, a delayed response there. One evening, during a conversation with a close friend, Pete was said to have paused mid-sentence, his expression holding for a second too long, as though the thought he was about to express had simply slipped away. It wasn't dramatic. No one reacted strongly. The conversation moved on. But the moment lingered in the minds of those who noticed. There was also that look. The kind that is difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore once seen. A gaze that lingered just a fraction longer than usual, not focused on anything specific, yet not entirely absent either. Yule would later find himself replaying that look over and over, trying to understand when exactly things began to change, while Linc held on to his belief that it was nothing serious, that it would pass, that it had to pass, because the alternative was too heavy to consider. Days turned into weeks, and the small signs quietly gathered, like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to complete. There were mornings when Pete seemed slower to rise, evenings when he spoke less, moments when he simply sat in silence longer than before. According to many sources, it was around this time that the family began to exchange glances rather than words, subtle, unspoken questions passing between them. Should they be worried, or were they overthinking? And in that fragile space between doubt and denial, time continued to move forward, carrying them closer to a truth that, at that point, still remained just out of reach. The turning point did not arrive with noise or urgency. It came quietly, almost cautiously, sometime weeks after those first unsettling signs began to gather. A routine health check, something that had been mentioned casually, almost as reassurance rather than concern. But according to many sources, it was during this moment that the first real shadow appeared. The results were, as it was described, not favorable, not definitive enough to be spoken out loud in full, yet heavy enough to change the air in the room. The hospital corridors felt colder that day. the kind of sterile silence that seemed to stretch longer than usual, broken only by distant footsteps and the low murmur of voices that never quite rose above a whisper. Doctors moved with measured calm, their expressions controlled, careful. But even in that restraint, there was something that the family could sense, something unspoken, something waiting just beneath the surface. Yule stood close, listening, trying to catch every word, every subtle change in tone, as if the truth might reveal itself between the pauses. While Linc remained slightly behind, arms folded, his gaze shifting between the floor and the walls, as though refusing to fully anchor himself in that moment. Because to do so would mean acknowledging what he had been trying to avoid all along. According to sources, it was after that day that everything began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in ways that quietly reshaped the rhythm of their lives. The phone calls became more frequent. Not long conversations, but short check-ins, repeated confirmations, voices that carried a weight they hadn't before. Family members who hadn't visited in a while began to appear more often. Gatherings that once felt casual now carried a strange stillness. People sat together, but spoke less. And when they did speak, their words seemed carefully chosen, as if trying not to disturb something fragile hanging in the air. And in the center of it all was Pete, unexpectedly calm, almost distant, as though he had already stepped into a space the others had not yet reached. He spoke less than before, choosing his words sparingly, sometimes answering questions with nothing more than a nod. Yet there was no visible fear, no outward resistance, only a quiet acceptance that made it even harder for those around him to hold on to denial. There were moments, small and easily overlooked, that carried more weight than anything else. One afternoon, he was seen sitting alone, a collection of old photographs spread across the table. Images from years long gone. Younger faces, brighter days, memories frozen in time. He picked one up, held it longer than the others, his eyes tracing details that only he could fully understand. The room remained silent, no one interrupting, as if instinctively aware that this was not a moment to be shared. Yule, standing by the doorway, watched without stepping in. Something about that stillness felt too personal, too final to disturb. Across the room, Linc shifted slightly, his expression tightening, as though each passing second made it harder to maintain the belief he had been holding on to. And then there was that sentence, simple, almost casual in its delivery, but carrying a weight that lingered long after it was spoken. "Everything will pass," Pete said quietly, not looking at anyone in particular, not directed, not explained, just left there, suspended in the air. No one responded immediately, because no one was certain what exactly it meant. Was it reassurance? Was it acceptance? Or was it something else entirely? The silence that followed felt different from the ones before. Deeper. More aware. As though in that moment, the truth had moved one step closer. Not fully revealed, not yet spoken aloud, but no longer hidden either. Outside, the world continued as it always had. Cars passed, voices echoed in the distance. But inside that space, time seemed to slow again, stretching each second into something heavier, something that could no longer be ignored. And yet even then, no one said it. Not directly, not completely. Because sometimes, the truth does not arrive as a single moment. It unfolds, slowly, quietly, until it is no longer possible to look away. The days that followed no longer moved quietly. They stretched, collided, overlapped, turning into something heavier, something harder to hold on to. According to many sources, this was the period believed to be the most intense phase of treatment. Though no one ever described it in full detail, the signs were there. The hospital became a second home, its sterile walls witnessing hours that seemed to blur into one another. Morning and night lost their meaning. Time was no longer measured in hours, but in test results, in brief updates, in the subtle changes no one could ignore. Footsteps echoed endlessly through the corridor, each one carrying either hope or something dangerously close to its absence. Doors opened and closed with quiet urgency, nurses moving in and out with careful precision, their faces composed, their voices low. Inside the room, however, everything felt amplified. Every breath, every pause, every glance. Yule remained close, almost constantly by his father's side. He stood tall when Pete was awake, his voice steady, his words chosen carefully, as if strength itself could be transferred through tone alone. He would adjust the blanket, ask simple questions, nod at every response, even when the answers came slower than before. But the moment he stepped outside, everything shifted. The hallway, long and dimly lit, became the place where he no longer had to hold it together. There were moments when he leaned against the cold wall, his head lowered, his breathing uneven. One hand pressed tightly against his face, as if trying to contain something that refused to stay inside. No one approached him during those moments. Not because they didn't care, but because they understood. Some emotions could not be witnessed. Across the same corridor, Linc moved differently, quieter, more distant. He spoke less with each passing day, answering questions briefly, avoiding conversations that circled too closely around the reality they were facing. When others mentioned treatment, progress, or possibilities, he would nod slightly, but rarely engage, as though saying the words out loud might make them irreversible. Instead, he kept his focus on small, practical things, checking schedules, speaking briefly with doctors, then stepping away before the conversation could deepen. It was not indifference. It was something closer to self-protection. Inside the room, Pete remained at the center of it all. Yet there was a noticeable stillness in him. According to those who observed closely, he carried himself with a quiet endurance, not resisting, not questioning, simply moving through each day as it came. Sometimes awake, sometimes resting, his presence filling the room even in silence. The machines continued their steady rhythm, marking time in a way that felt both necessary and unbearable. There were nights when the corridor grew almost completely silent, only the faint hum of distant equipment breaking the stillness. And then suddenly, footsteps again. Quick, urgent, approaching, the door opening, a brief exchange of words, then closing once more, each cycle leaving behind a tension that never fully dissolved. Each day that passed, hope seemed to grow smaller. The thought was never spoken directly, yet it lingered in every glance, every pause between conversations. Yule began to notice it in the way doctors chose their words. Careful, measured, never absolute. Linc felt it in the lengthening silences that followed each update. Even the smallest details carried weight. The sound of shoes against the polished floor, the soft click of the door handle, the faint rustle of fabric as someone shifted in their seat. Everything felt magnified, as if the world outside had been muted, leaving only these fragments behind. One evening, as the light from the corridor dimmed slightly, Yule stood just outside the room, his hand resting on the door but not pushing it open. Inside, Pete lay still, the machines continuing their quiet work. For a moment he hesitated, as if preparing himself before stepping back into that space where he had to be strong again. A few steps away, Linc stood with his back against the wall, eyes lowered, saying nothing. The silence between them stretched, not empty, but filled with everything neither of them could bring themselves to say, and somewhere within that silence, the realization continued to grow. Slow, inevitable. moving closer with each passing hour. Without ever needing to be spoken aloud, 0241. The same room, the same pale light. But now everything felt different, as if the air itself had grown heavier, pressing down on every surface, every breath, every heartbeat. The machines that once filled the silence with a steady rhythm began to change. Not abruptly, not loudly, but slowly, subtly, their sounds stretching farther apart, each signal lingering just a little longer before the next. According to many sources, this was believed to be the moment no one had wanted to name, the moment that had been approaching quietly through every hour, every passing day. Now standing still in the center of the room, Pete Edochie lay as he had before, unmoving beneath the cold white light, his face calm in a way that felt almost distant. The rise and fall of his chest had grown faint, each breath softer than the last. And around him, no one moved too quickly, no one spoke too loudly, as if even the smallest disturbance might break something fragile that could not be restored. Yule stood closest, closer than he had been before, his hand gently holding his father's, fingers wrapped carefully as though afraid to apply too much pressure. His grip was steady, but there was something in it, something that revealed how much effort it took to remain that way. His eyes did not leave Pete's face, searching for any sign, any movement, any response that might still connect them in that moment. But the silence between them grew deeper, heavier. Behind him, a few steps away, Linc remained where he had been for what felt like an eternity. He did not step forward, not because he didn't want to, but because something held him back, something invisible yet impossible to overcome. His hands hung at his sides, fingers slightly curled, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed somewhere near the bed, but never fully settling, as if coming closer would force him to accept what he had spent so long trying not to see. The room itself seemed to pause. Even the faint hum of electricity felt distant now. And then, a small movement, almost imperceptible. Yule's hand shifted slightly, tightening just enough to hold on a little longer. And in that exact moment, a single tear slipped free, falling slowly, quietly, landing on Pete's hand without a sound. The drop lingered there, catching the faint light before disappearing against his skin. No one reacted. No one spoke, because the weight of that moment did not need acknowledgement. It was already understood. The machine beside the bed changed again, its rhythm no longer steady, the sound stretching, uneven now, each interval longer, more uncertain, the kind of sound that made time feel fragile. According to sources, those were believed to be the final moments, but even that thought remained unspoken within the room, because saying it would make it real in a way no one was ready to face. Yule leaned slightly closer, his voice almost forming words but never fully releasing them. Linc's breathing grew shallower, his chest rising and falling with quiet restraint. Somewhere beyond the door, footsteps passed, distant, unaware, life continuing just outside the space where everything had come to a near standstill. Inside, however, nothing moved forward. Nothing moved back. Everything simply existed in that suspended second. The machine let out another sound, longer this time, stretching into the silence that followed, and still, no one spoke. Because in that moment, there was nothing left to say that could change what was already unfolding. And yet, the door remained slightly open, the faint light from the hallway slipping into the room, as if waiting, as if expecting something, or someone, that never came. The sound fades first, not completely, but enough to leave behind something softer, something almost weightless. The machines that once marked every second now seem distant, as if their purpose has quietly slipped away. The room remains, unchanged, yet entirely different. The hospital bed stands still at the center, the sheets smoothed, undisturbed, empty. The cold white light has softened into something dimmer, filtered now through a thin curtain where a faint glow from the outside world barely finds its way in. Shadows stretch gently across the floor, unmoving. Time no longer presses forward here. It lingers, suspended. A small table sits beside the bed. On it, a single photograph. A captured moment from another time. Faces closer, brighter, untouched by what would come later. The frame catches a trace of light, just enough to reveal outlines but not details, as if the memory itself prefers to remain quiet, untouched. No voices fill the space. No footsteps approach. Only the stillness that follows after everything has already happened. Near the window, Yule stands without movement, his figure outlined against the faint light beyond the glass. He does not turn, does not step away. His hands rest at his sides, still, as though even the smallest motion would disturb the fragile calm that has settled around him. His gaze remains fixed somewhere beyond the room, or perhaps nowhere at all. Behind him, closer to the wall, Linc sits alone. His posture lowered, shoulders slightly curved inward, his head bowed, eyes cast down, not searching, not focusing, simply remaining. The silence between them is not empty. It carries something deeper, something that no longer needs to be spoken. Beside the bed, the chair remains slightly angled, as if someone had just stood up moments ago, left behind without being moved back into place. It stays there, untouched, holding the shape of absence, a quiet imprint of what had once been. The curtain shifts almost imperceptibly. A soft movement, barely noticeable, as a faint breeze slips through somewhere unseen. The sound it carries is subtle, a whisper more than anything else. The kind of sound that might be missed if one were not already listening for it. Outside the room, the corridor remains dim, distant, disconnected. And then, the door, still not fully closed, moves slightly, just enough to widen the narrow gap that has been there all along. The light from the hallway stretches a little further across the floor, pale, quiet, waiting. No footsteps follow. No shadow crosses the threshold. No voice breaks the silence. The door simply remains open, as if expecting something that never arrives. Inside, nothing changes. The bed remains empty, the photograph still, the chair unmoved. Yule stands by the window, Linc sits alone, and the faint sound of the wind continues to pass through the room, slow, distant, almost unreal, until even that becomes part of the silence.